Hello and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to be building a project together. The project we're going to be building is this shopping list. In this shopping list you'll be able to add items, specify their amount, and add them to a list. The list will automatically append and it will display it. We'll also be able to delete items from the list. The things that we're going to need to start this project are an index.html file and a script.js file. Make sure to add your HTML5 boilerplate, like so, and include the script file. Like so. We now have access to our script file. We can test this by including some code in the script file. Open this file in the browser, and then open our console. And we can see that test works. The first thing we're going to need is a container for our form. We need a form with an ID of item form. This form won't have an action. We need a div for item input. The input for this will be text. Let's give it an ID of item name. This will allow us to address it in JavaScript easily. We need another div, another label, this time for the amount. An input of type number. We can give this an ID of item amount. And finally, we need a button of type submit. We can give it the internal text of add item. Next, we'll need a container for our shopping list. And an unordered list to actually contain the items. Let's give the shopping list an ID of shopping list. This should cover all of our HTML needs. Now we'll start working with our JavaScript. We need to wait for everything to load before we start addressing it. To do this, we call window.onload. Window is an object that comes with the browser. It basically refers to the entire browser window and all of its contents. Onload can be set to a function, and it'll call that function when the entire window is finally loaded. We'll create another function called init shopping list. By making this init shopping list function, we'll be able to keep our concerns separated. This makes sure that certain functions only do one thing. This will also make it easier for us to expand the onload functionality later on, should we need to. To create a function, we need the keyword function, followed by the name, the parentheses, and these curly braces. The curly braces contain all the logic of our function. Now we need to think about what exactly we need for the shopping list. Well, we need to be able to get information from our form. The way that we can do this is by saying, declaring a variable with the keyword let, declaring the variable name, we'll call this form, and then calling document.get element by ID. And we can call the ID item form, like we declared in our HTML. If you get this error, you simply need to go into Preferences, Languages and Frameworks, JavaScript, and change JavaScript language version to ECMAScript 6. Click OK, and the error should go away. Let's console log our form to make sure that we're able to get the reference. As you can see, we now have our form with the item name, the amount, and the Add Item button. We've console logged our form, and we can see the entire thing here. Next, we need to capture the submit. To do this, we'll call our form and say .add event listener. The event that we're going to be listening to is the submit event. We also need to make a function that will be called once this event takes place. This function syntax might be a little weird. These parentheses are essentially the same thing as these parentheses. It just doesn't have a name. This arrow just tells JavaScript that the function that belongs to these parentheses is between these two curly braces. We also need to pass a variable into this function. We'll call it E or event. I'll keep it event for now to make it more clear, but you'll oftentimes see just E. This variable name doesn't really matter. We can name it anything we want, but event is clear and E is usually a standard. Let's create another function called handle item form. As you can see, I'm breaking out the logic into tinier functions. This makes our code more maintainable and readable. Let's pass it in the event and the form reference. If you remember from the programming fundamentals section, we're able to get the form reference inside of this function because of the scoping of JavaScript. Form is defined outside of this function, therefore we have access to it. If we were to define a function inside of this function, we would not have access to it outside. Let's make sure that we're passing in the right things. First things first, we need to call prevent default. This will prevent JavaScript from automatically submitting the form and refreshing the page as if it were trying to submit it to a back-end service. We're not doing that now, so we just need to prevent it. This if block here is simply checking whether or not the prevent default function exists on the event parameter. If it doesn't, it'll simply skip over it. This is to create backwards compatibility with older browsers. You may need to do this with several things. Refer to the documentation to find out which things you actually need to do this for. You also need to return false. This is also for backwards compatibility. Let's console log the event to see what we have so far. it's a good idea to test your code in small chunks. This makes it easier to catch a problem early on. If you don't test your code often, you might have to debug several hundreds or more lines of code. Let's clear our console. And you can see that we're now console logging the event. The event is an object that JavaScript provides us. There are many different properties on this object, and you can learn more about them by searching the documentation. Simply search JavaScript event object in Google. Now that we know that's working, and the submit isn't refreshing our page, we need to figure out what we need to do next. Well, we have everything that we need from the form, so what can we do with it? Well, we need to add our items to a shopping list. So let's say add item to list. We need to create this function. Inside of this function, we need to get references to each input itself. We'll get a reference to the item name by calling document get element by ID again. Let's double check what we called it. We called it item name. So we simply fill that in here. Item amount. If you're going to copy and paste, make sure that you double check everything and make sure that everything is changed appropriately. What we need to do now is create an HTML element that we can append to our page. To do this, let's create another function called create list item HTML. Make sure that your function names are rather explicit and they explain what the function is doing. Here we can return a string. We're just going to build out a list item. This is incomplete, but it'll serve for testing purposes. We can now get the returned value, which is the string containing the HTML list item that we created, and assign it to a variable. Call this item HTML. Now I need a reference to item list. Simply call the shopping list ID that we assigned earlier. Then we'll need to use a function called insert adjacent HTML on the item list object reference. This will tell the browser that we're trying to insert HTML and to read it as HTML rather than just plain text. We'll say after end, which tells JavaScript where to insert it, and then pass it the HTML that we created earlier. Let's test this. Refresh your browser after saving. We're getting an error here. Let's try to figure out why. Well, What we're trying to insert is item.html, and it's only returning as undefined. So let's find out why. To do this, we can console log item.html, like so. Save and refresh. And item.html is returning as undefined. The reason why is because we've been adding this code to the wrong place. So let's put it in the proper place. Just cut this out. Leave the add item to shopping list in the handle item form function. And then call the proper function of create list item HTML. You can come across simple mistakes like that every once in a while. You just need to take your time to read your code and make sure that everything is in the right place. Now we're getting back the right result. The list item is appending to the shopping list, and our submit works. Now we just need to pass in the proper variables and use what is called templating strings in ECMAScript 6, like so. We can call the value of the form, like this. And when we submit our form, we should get those values on our element. But wait, we're getting an error. Item name is not defined, but we're defining it here. Why can't we see it? Well, you may be asking yourself, we did create it outside of this function, so why aren't we able to see it because of the scope? Well, we defined the function itself outside of the function where we're calling it. That prevents us from seeing the scope of the function that called it originally. So we'll need to pass those items in. We can actually just pass the value themselves in, as we don't need the references. Now let's save, refresh, and test it. Now we're getting the proper values of test and 1 when we submit our form. Everything seems to be working so far. Our next and final step is to add the delete functionality. We'll do that in the next video.